Good evening. How are you? Well, it's nice out. It's overcast. There's no wind. And it's 50 degrees, and that's not fair. I want more spring-like weather. But I'm comfortable. I'm wearing those kinds of clothes, and I got out of my my suit and stuff because I had some things to do at our place. The news today continues to be the sad story of our banks, our banking, where we put our money on deposit and trust and hope it'll be there. And if handled at all, it'll be handled in such a way as not to compromise it. But apparently there are some banks, and they seem to be west of the Mississippi, that are having some very serious problems. And in the market today, the banks are having trouble holding onto their value because they're falling in value, which is not a good thing. Some experts are saying things like, well, there are opportunities here. Like what? Buy low, sell high, but you don't get to sell high if the bank is eliminated. And so that's one of the problems here. And it's eliminated by being absorbed in another bank. And people who own portions of that bank that's failing, they're out of luck. And if you're a depositor, if you have more than $250,000, you're at risk because the FDIC may or may not decide to extend that. And so then that cost gets passed on to us as taxpayers, not directly, but it's in the game. And, you know, the next concern is, what is the Federal Reserve going to do? Is it going to increase rates? And you may remember one example I gave was that the bank was receiving 3% return and then going out and borrowing funds at 5%. And like I said, you know, it doesn't take much of a mathematical child to realize that's not a formula that can work very long. So the banks are being squeezed, and the question is, will they be squeezed even more tomorrow if the rates go higher? And I think, you know, if you would try to call the shots, the financial answer is they're going to do that because the banks are not paying attention. And how you introduce discipline without creating chaos, that's the challenge. Now, on the category of the environment, there's an event in Illinois that I find particularly interesting because it reminds me of the Great Dust Bowls that started these conservation districts, that is the soil and water conservation districts. And their concept was, after the Dust Bowl, to have best management practices so as not to risk losing the soil, which takes 1,000 years to form, by doing best practices in the agriculture environment that you find yourself. But they didn't, and they planted things they shouldn't have. And so when a drought came, all of it turned to dust, and it blew across the United States, coast to coast. And the suffering human was enormous. The supply of food was compromised. And so we have to be very careful about these things, but we're not always so careful about it. And the most recent example is that out in Illinois, there was a dust storm, and it caused a pileup of 90 vehicles on I-55 in Illinois. Now, we often have basically an advisory, no tilling. And why? Because tilling is breaking up the soil on the surface, right? And it breaks apart the soil structure and the fungal mycelial, the connections. And when that happens, they're more susceptible to being blown away. But what is plowing? Plowing is more serious tillage because you dig deeper into the ground to form that plow. And so tillage is lesser than plowing. Plowing is greater tillage. And we haven't heard the studies yet, hopefully we will, that teach us what went on here. But they did plowing, it loosened the earth, a 40-mile-an-hour wind came along, blew it up into the sky, and we have a pileup on the highway because of it, in which some people did die, as happens in accidents such as this. Losing visibility meant that's what happened. So this is one of these environmental warnings, if you will, that we have to double down on being careful about how we handle our agriculture, just as we have to have discipline in the banks. And there are rules we can follow, but it's sort of like some people say, I can get away with that. That's not going to cause me any problems, and then it does. So it's a pretty terrifying thing. And when I was a kid, I think I mentioned it before, on Saturdays, there was a thing called The Morning Farmer. And if any of you ever watched it, send me a note telling me that you did, because I have friends that don't believe it's true. But it came on at 6 a.m. on a Saturday, and it was probably in the 50s. And I sat there with the volume down, because my parents, if they slept in, I didn't want to disturb them. And their room was through a pair of French doors into the living room where I was watching this. And I just loved watching it. It was mostly about agricultural management. And so I was a strange kid. What could I tell you? I was interested in it. And it's one of the reasons I do what I do today. But we have to study it as farmers, as citizens. We have to understand some of these basic rules. And it's clear to me, the older I get, that we all would have profited by a course in health, a course in farming, a course in the law, civil and criminal. Because not only does it have a rich history that explains a lot of what's going on in common affairs if you study social studies or history or any of these things, but we don't do it. And so we reach an older age and we say, hey, how did that happen? Because we have no clue, and that's wrong. In terms of weather, in Virginia, I understand from reports that a tornado hit Virginia Beach. I don't know what the adverse effect was yet. I'm sure we'll find out in not too long a period of time. So sorry, I had my finger in the way for a while. I meant nothing by it. It was an accident. I don't know if it fomented anyone, but it was just hovering there for a little bit. The last thing that I can't look away from is Tacopina going after the woman raped by Trump, and I believe that's true, and that's why I say it. And the testimony today, as I understand it, was that a friend took the stand who was called shortly after the Trump accosted her at Bergdorf Goodman's. And she told how upset she was, and the friend has described how she was breathing heavy and upset, and she advised her to go to the police, and she said she wouldn't do that, and she asked her not to tell anybody else, because in those days, the adverse circumstances that were visited upon a woman who would complain about a man doing anything like this, particularly a prominent one like Trump, who is known well to us former Manhattanites, former New Yorkers. And he was the greasy pole from Queens that came to Manhattan, and as far as we could tell, cheated in every way possible. And somehow or other tricked America into putting him in the White House by playing the game of the Electoral College, though he didn't get a popular vote to be president. And so now we're keeping him at a distance, but we're not prosecuting him for who and what he is. So that's my thinking today, and it's a robust day out here on the trail where I am with my cathedral of trees, unconcerned about the royalty across the pond, because I'm not a guy who thinks that much of the British, and I don't think that much about royalty. And I think that kind of concentration of wealth for people who do nothing but advertise the history of their organization just doesn't sit well with me. So, goodbye from my cathedral of trees. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.